Morning. This meeting of the Conflicts of Interest Board is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Offices Law, Section 100 et sec. For purposes of this meeting, I shall designate Julia Lee as our recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of the proposed amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York as continuing from the August 22nd, 2018 open meeting, and Board Rule 1-13. Are there any comments from the board or staff on the draft of proposed amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York? Now, as remember this, we discussed this at some length last time. We had some comments. There were some revisions made in light of our comments. And Chad, why don't you very briefly tell us what the revisions were, remind us of our comments, and remind us of what you did, and then before we actually begin any formal deliberation.
So, we've made changes to the section of proposed, apologies. Proposed 1-10 to clarify the payment of recurring expenses.
Okay, so that's in exhibit, that's marked in
That's exhibit 3,
yep.
Page 22, lines 14 to 15.
Okay. Okay, hold on one second. I'm sorry, 22, right?
22.
You just said 22. Okay. Lines 14 to 15, yep, I see that.
And then in the same section, section 12, page 22, lines 11 through 13.
Right, we had discussion of this last time.
Right. And then there were 3 issues where after the board meeting, staff went back and conducted additional research and conversations with the law department that we wanted to bring back to the board. Okay. One of which is also on page 22, section 10, lines 7 to 8,
okay.
Which refers to the ownership in cooperative apartment buildings.
Right.
As part of the board discussion, there was perhaps a consensus to remove it, but after conducting additional research, staff found a waiver that the board had issued to a public servant who owned shares in a cooperative apartment building with one of their subordinates, and it had 5 shareholders. So at the time, the board issued a waiver to this public servant so that they could continue being the subordinate public servant's superior in light of that business or financial relationship.
So this is consistent with our overall goal in this of codifying to the extent possible pre-existing advisory opinions.
Exactly.
Or waivers, whether or not they took a formal form. So this is consistent with what the central thrust of this rule. Okay.
Right, because last time we weren't
sure.
aware
Why are we
of
doing
one.
this? We didn't,
Right.
there were
Exactly.
no cases.
Right. But because the board hasn't spoken specifically about condominium
Right.
buildings, it has not included that in this rule. It addresses only cooperative apartment
Okay.
buildings, as addressed in COIB case number 2006-805.
Okay. Are there any other changes we should be? I mean, obviously there were some maybe minor changes, but any other changes that are worth that we want to pay particular attention to?
In keeping with that, on page 18 of Exhibit 3, line 19, local public authorities.
Right.
The board asked staff to sort of go back and dig a little bit about what was intended by this, and in conversation with the law department, we were directed to a statutory meeting for that provision in the Public Authorities Law, as amended in 2005, and which defines a local public authority as a in the Public Authorities Law. So we propose retaining that provision as. And then also the commentary has been advised to reflect that reference to the statute.
Okay.
And that's on page 4, lines 9 through 15.
I see it. Okay. Okay.
And then there's one additional section, which is on page 19, lines 5 through 7.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Page 19, lines 5 through 7,
Oh, got it.
Exhibit 3.
Right.
And that references an attempt to define the term used in the statute, that in the statute it refers to local development corporations or other similar entities. And over the course of its history interpreting that term, the board has always thought of this in terms of public or quasi-public entities. However, a local development corporation has, there's another subset of local development corporations incorporated by private people, and they operate like regular not-for-profits. And the board has issued waivers to public servants seeking to work for those sorts of local development corporations, as if they were any other sort of not-for-profit, and has clearly not thought about those private local development corporations as public or quasi-public entities in the way of these other non-firms. And so we propose to clarify that in sub B to indicate that the local development corporations used in the provision of the charter means these affiliated, sponsored by, created by New York State government, New York County, city, towns, villages.
Again, that's consistent with the central thrust of this, of codifying what we've been doing.
Exactly.
Okay. Questions, comments from the board? I had one. Forgive me. It's actually two, but it's the same one in two different places. And I guess I was working off of Exhibit 4.
Yes.
But I would suggest that page 4, page 7, line 4, and I guess earlier, these are in the comments. Page 4, either line 15 or page 5, line 7, that we insert language that copies from the rule that something to the effect of these entities or these examples are not exclusive. In other words, the rule itself says that, but it's not on the comments. And just to make sure that sometimes people only read the comments because they're easier to read. And you could use, I would say, you could use language as close to the rule itself, such along the lines of, as stated in the rule. I was thinking of.
Are you on Exhibit 4?
I'm on Exhibit 4. Yeah, sorry, I was working on Exhibit 4.
Yeah.
Page 4.
So Exhibit 4.
Not page 7.
Exhibit 4. Let's start with page 7, line 4. The very end of the comment. I propose we add a sentence that says something along the lines of, as stated in rule, whatever the number of this new rule is, this list is, how is it stated? I need to flip forward and find how it actually is stated.
Includes but is not limited.
Includes but is not limited to the provisions and the examples in the rule. We say it in the rule, and the rule is what really matters, I think, but just in case somebody only reads the comments. And I would do the same thing for the comments of the other rule. I was slightly less certain where it ought to go. It could go either, that's either at the, on page 4, line 7, the end of, which is the end of the paragraph, or the end of the following paragraph. Page 4, line 15, sorry, or page 5, line 7. I just wasn't sure where it made the most logical sense. But I would make the same point. I would use the language as close to the rule itself as possible, just the includes but is not limited to language, just in case somebody reads the comments and doesn't focus on the rule. It's just a matter of avoiding any ambiguity or confusion. But that was that's my only comment. Otherwise, I am fine. Do you have a thought as to whether we're for the end of page 4, line 15, or page 5, line 7? I couldn't figure out where it fit better.
Maybe at the bottom of page 4, line 15 makes sense, because
okay.
that's the description of the rule.
That seems right. Okay, that sounds, I am fine with that. So, following the conclusion of our substantive discussion, I will move that we add that. Do I need to do this formally?
Yeah, we've already discussed this, so you can do it when you actually pick up.
Okay, so does the board agree with this suggestion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Further questions, comments, suggestions? Are we ready to take this up formally? Can I now call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York as the final rule, with a very modest modification to the comments that I just made?
Second.
Do you have a motion? I had a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. The motion for adoption of the proposed amendments as presented with the modest modification as discussed as the final rule has passed. That concludes our, that does not conclude. We have more. Wait, there's more. We also have before us consideration of the proposed amendments to Board Rule 1-13. Chad, again, update us into what's been happening with Rule 1-13.
So staff proposes this second change to the board's rules in light of advice requests that we've been receiving over the years. So Charter Section 2604B4 prohibits public servants from engaging in activity that's in conflict with their official duties, and the board has promulgated rules in 113 codifying that, prohibiting public servants from using city time and city resources as part of any non-city activity. And that allows the board to penalize public servants who violate this provision with fines. As part of this rule, in 113C, the board allowed for a limited exception for public servants to use city time and city resources for personal and private activities, provided that there was some sort of benefit to the city. And the board did this in light of sort of these considerations that there are activities that public servants engage in, like pro bono legal activities, that have benefits to the public servant, but also provide benefits to the city. But over the years, staff has been faced with sort of an increasing number of questions from public servants asking whether their activities are permissible or whether they require board approval pursuant to 113C, and staff has been increasingly at a loss to determine whether these activities, we've been increasingly unable to direct public servants to clear guidance saying that their activities are permissible, because often they're increasingly tied to their city duties. You'll have public servants serving on the boards of not-for-profits as representatives of their agency, but they have a board position, or they're engaging in activities such as fundraising, research, or services for a not-for-profit, but it's really part of their city job. And this activity isn't city activity, but it is not personal and private activity for which a 113C letter would be appropriate. And so staff proposes this change to the rule, which would allow public servants to be designated to perform work on behalf of these not-for-profits by their agency head, without requiring board approval, and would only require board approval if the public servant's proposed work on behalf of the not-for-profit would involve their participation in the not-for-profit's business dealings, if any, with the city. And this would provide a mechanism by which public servants would be able to put their work sort of clearly in a category that is permissible, and it would allow agency heads to have a clearer control over these sorts of activities.
If I could just say a couple things about this. There's throughout the history of this board since 1990, there's been a tremendous growth in the number of public servants who hold either formal positions or sort of informal positions at not-for-profits doing work on behalf of that not-for-profit, essentially as part of their city job duties. And early in the board's history, the board was actually giving people moonlighting waivers for doing this as if it were an outside position. But the truth is, it's not personal and private activity. It's actually, something that they're doing really as part of their city job. They're in many cases even being assigned to do so by their supervisors. The board moved away from granting moonlighting waivers for this activity, but we are getting an increasing number of inquiries about, whether or not public servants can take these sorts of positions. It's difficult to figure out in some cases whether it really is part of their city job or whether it's something they're doing in their private capacities. And some of the public servants who are doing this work purportedly as part of their city job are actually occasionally working on both sides of the same matter, dealing with an RFP in their city work and working for a not-for-profit that is providing a response to that RFP, for example. And so this rule is intended to provide clear guidance to public servants about how to do that. Part of it is to figure out clearly whether or not that position or work is part of their city job, and that's done by this designation function. And the other part of it is to require them to come to the board if, in fact, they are working, on that sort of city business in the work that they're doing for that not-for-profit. So it's an attempt to get clarity about what people's positions are and make sure that in those few instances where there might be a conflict, the board can weigh in and figure out what to do about that, including by giving permission for people to go ahead and participate in that activity.
So I have one substantive question and a handful of minor suggestions / corrections. Substantive question, it really is a question, is on page 7, B. The point about the purposes of the section, the sponsorship of discretionary funding by elected officials will not constitute participation in an entity's business dealings with the city. So why is that? Can we get a fuller, I think there was a reference to it, but I found the explanation kind of cryptic. So
What page is that?
Page 7 of Exhibit 1. The top 4 lines, lines 2 to 4. Just explain is the only thing that I wrote in the margin. Why is that?
The idea there's an advisory opinion that exists that governs the participation of city council members in not-for-profit organizations in which they designate, in which they participate in discretionary funds. When they're in those situations, when they have some sort of role at that not-for-profit, they can't sponsor those discretionary funds, but they're permitted to vote on those discretionary funds. So this is just saying this rule is not intended to address that issue. That issue is addressed elsewhere, and if we could consider trying to codify that piece as board rules at some later date. But the point was that this rule shouldn't interfere with that regime that's already a well-functioning regime that we have with the city council right now.
And is that explained in the statement of basis and purpose? The answer could be yes, but I just don't remember seeing it.
No, an earlier advisory opinion addressing the role of elected officials in these not-for-profits is addressed, but not specifically the advisory opinion about the sponsorship of discretionary funds.
I would put that in because otherwise it jumps out at you. And at first it seems like a giant loophole. If it turns out it's just a codification of existing practice and there's other rules that address it, that makes it a lot easier to understand what's going on because it jumps out. I think it needs to be explained. I was going to say better, I think it just needs to be explained.
Yep.
What are some examples of work by a city employee for a not-for-profit that has been deemed to be in furtherance of city purpose?
Well, I mean, I think there's an enormous range, truly an enormous range. The examples of these that have spurred us to propose this rule are of this second group, the kind where we get questions from. We've had, for example, a question from a high-ranking employee of a city agency who is assigned by the agency head to serve on the board of a not-for-profit organization. That not-for-profit organization was responding to an RFP at that employee's city agency. That employee is responsible for dealing with the issuance of that RFP, the oversight of that RFP at that city agency, and staff found that to be sort of a difficult question for us to deal with. We didn't feel like Chapter 68 really provided very clear guidance because the person was functioning in his city role in both places, but generally speaking, and generally speaking, the board has allowed public servants to do this kind of work for not-for-profit organizations. But in this case, it seemed like this public servant was working on both ends of the same city business. Those are the kinds that concern us the most, which is why the second part of the rule requires those folks to come to the board for approval. The other way in which we frequently see this is we will be dealing with matters and looking at, for example, the board composition of a not-for-profit organization, and see public servants listed as members of these boards with their city titles and so forth, and there's no way to know whether or not that public servant is there acting in his or her, as part of his or her city job duties, or whether that's something that's personal and private to that person. And so it's sort of how Chapter 68 would apply to that person is unclear. And so the first part of this rule is just an attempt to get clarity. Are you there as part of your city job duties, or are you there in your personal capacity?
But we're saying we're not going to look at that. We're saying an agency head could designate somebody, or presumably herself, to serve in that capacity without oversight by the board, without coming to the board.
But that provides the clarity. If the agency head designates an employee of his or her city agency to do that, then we know that that person is doing that as part of his or her city job.
Do we know? I mean, we're relying on the agency head. We're not looking at it.
The designation is
the
public
designation is
and
disclosed.
required to be made to the Conflicts of Interest Board.
In many ways, what we have now, the reason the board moved away from the issuing of A waivers, moonlighting waivers, for people who are serving on these boards and with these entities as part of their city jobs, is as a conceptual thing, it becomes difficult to say that you need a waiver to do what is your city job. And in the regime that we have now, many public servants simply don't have the ability to receive a document saying that you are doing the thing that you're being asked to do as part of your city job. An agency head making this designation is the agency head's determination. If the agency head does not want the public servant to be serving on this not-for-profit in their official capacity, there is the 113C avenue available to them. And the public servant will be able to do this as part of their private life. But by requiring the agency head or a deputy mayor, if the person who's receiving the designation is the agency head, we require that this really is something that the city is asking this person to do, is directing them to do.
Could we have the agency head request the waiver?
Well, the way the second part of this proposed rule works is if the agency head designates somebody, one of his subordinates to...
The second part. I'm still on the first part.
Well, the second, I think the second part answers your question.
Second part, I understand you to be saying is a situation where there are business dealings.
Oh, you're saying why not have the agency head seek a waiver for the person in
the first instance?
It's because I think the answer, Jeff, is that just our experience is that would be a big shift in what's been happening currently. We almost never get waiver requests from agencies for people who are doing work for a not-for-profit as part of their city job. And a lot of the examples we get are, an auditor at a city agency wants to be on the National Association of Auditors. It's good for their profession. It's good for the agency to have this person be on the auditing committee. But they're doing work for the National Association of Auditors. They're running a conference. They're doing stuff that's not fulfilling the mission of their agency. And just the board historically hasn't been looking to those as A positions because they're not, they don't have responsibilities. It's really part of their city job to do that. We haven't been issuing waivers for, people who have ex officio positions on boards. Even though they have positions, it just hasn't been part of the board practice. So this is a way to sort of acknowledge what's been going on in actuality, but have disclosure added to it. We don't think that the board necessarily needs to be in the business of deciding on top of an agency head deciding whether or not someone doing their city job at a not-for-profit is acting in conflict with the interests of the city. That's a staff judgment that this is not something this will be a shift enough in the practice to have disclosure.
So on that point about the disclosure, should there be any clarity or additional information on the timing for the disclosure? Is it when the designation happens? Is it within some certain amount of time? Is it when you notice that this person is on the board or doing whatever happens, if there's going to be some new section on the website?
Right, that's right.
And I don't know what's a reasonable time. It would seem to be like within X time of the actual designation.
Right, that's right.
That's a good point.
But our thinking was that the designation would have to precede the activity, that you would have to be designated to engage in this activity. You could not engage in the activity and then receive a designation after the fact.
But Erica, you would like to have like a number, like 30 days or 60 days or 10 days or something like that. inserted
Something,
in the
because
rule.
I don't know what it means that it's disclosed and posted on the website.
So this would be
I know
on-
what that means, but.
Page 7, line 5,
Right.
disclosed to the Conflict of Interest Board within 30 days? I mean, does that seem like a
Yep.
reasonable amount of time?
And I think that also might help, I don't know, Jeff, I think that it gets to your point a little bit, like if you know as the agency head that you have to meet this standard and have, this is gonna be disclosed, I think that might put a little weight on your considerations of the factors in designating the person in the first place versus don't ask, don't tell.
Right.
And will the disclosure have to include the 4 elements of the demonstrable nexus, that provision?
I mean, the disclosure the disclosure is essentially saying that there is, such a nexus. Are you?
Well, because I had some questions on the process too, like the timing and everything. But like, what is that? What is actually going to be the contents of the designation that they disclose and is posted on the website?
Yeah, I was just imagining that it was just a disclosure of which public servant and what not-for-profit
What agency
organization.
or which
Right,
organization.
That this is, that they've considered this and made this determination that it, so.
So it's almost more of a.
Of the site, like the following have been designated by their agency heads for these nonprofits, and then it'll just be a list. That's how I.
But I guess
So
to Jeff's
the
point,
Jane
it's
Doe
not-
of the Controller's Office is designated to the National Association of Lawyers.
That's exactly
That's what you
right.
envision,
Yep.
something not much longer than that.
Right, that's exactly what
but we're
Very
not.
similar to the substantial policymakers.
Right, but we're not setting it up in a way where we can see how the agency head made the determination of what the demonstrable nexus to the 4 factors.
Right, it was not our intent to require disclosure of their analysis of that.
So it's almost like they're certifying that they've met these requirements.
Right.
And again, just consistent with that, they don't have to demonstrate to tell us the things on page 6. They just have to persuade themselves.
And be comfortable with it
Right,
being public, right?
right.
And be comfortable being public,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
This is a
Right.
standard they use for them. This is not a criticism, but this is a standard they should use for themselves in making this judgment, and we rely on the self-certification.
Right, it's similar to what agency heads do when they decide, without the board's involvement, that an employee can serve on the board of a not-for-profit that has business dealings with that city agency. That's a determination the board's not involved in. The
Right.
agency head makes it on his or her own.
And often, in our experience, agency heads themselves may not be in the best position to know what's going on. And this requires the agency head to know, and requires the agency head to be able to make the determination. This can no longer happen at a sub-agency head level, where a unit manager might have a different idea of the interests of the agency than the agency head. Part of the problem that we've encountered is that public servants will come to us seeking this advice because they've been engaging in the activity for years. And we no longer have the ability to sort of point them to a place to say, what you've been doing is correct. This will allow us to say, if you do this, there won't be a problem. We'll be able to answer those questions about people who have been doing this activity for a long time, often.
So do those have to still be disclosed after the fact?
Yes.
had a are we,
Let's say anything
Yeah, I
substantive.
still have a
let's
couple
go to
questions.
substantive, and
I
then we
just want to
have
kind of
the
work out
minor
the
points.
logistics
Yeah,
here.
yeah, okay.
So basically, we're adopting like a self-certification model for this school.
Well, no, the employee doing the work or holding the position isn't certifying himself. The head of that employee's agency.
Sorry, an agency self-certification.
Right.
Okay. So to Jeff's point, then, it's really, we're relying on the agency, and will this be a non-reviewable decision?
I think that it'll be reviewable in that if we see someone who is in a position where it appears that they are engaging in city business dealings, we can certainly go back to them and say, you're not complying with part 2 of this rule. And then, of course, the reality is we get asked about this all the time, and that's true for example, many of the exceptions in the gift rules, for example, don't require anyone to come to us to ask us anything. But agencies make determinations about whether or not gifts fit into those exceptions all the time. They come to us when they have questions about that. That's just a regular part of the way our law works. Large parts of it are just like any other law. People read it and make their own determinations about it, and they come to us for advice when they feel like they need it. If they're not in compliance, however, by codifying this as a rule, it would be. I'm not envisioning that this would happen, but it would technically be subject to enforcement authority.
And Fernando, an example is agencies designate who in their agency has substantial policy discretion. That's a determination they make. If we get a list with 1,000 people on it from an agency that has 2,000 people, we say, this doesn't look right to us. Why are there so many people on it? Not all these people can possibly have substantial policy discretion. We think your analysis is off. Similarly, if we get a list with 1 person on it, we're like, no, this can't be right. Where's your general counsel? Where's your whole executive staff? So we're getting these lists, and if we see something that doesn't sort of pass the smell test about someone who's working at a not-for-profit, that we're like, well, this is a Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Why is this person working at a playground not-for-profit? We can engage in those conversations. The question is whether it should be staff made a determination that the work, not involvement in the city business, but just the work is something that the agency head should do independently and shouldn't require board stamp of approval.
And then we'll deal with the outliers on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly right.
When you're monitoring.
This also just in terms of, again, resources. So sometimes the issue comes up when Jane Doe, the controller's office, is that the first secretary of audits, the National Audits Commission, when they have their annual conference in Las Vegas, city money can pay for her trip there.
Yes.
As part of city resources. Okay, just clarifying that when she goes to the annual convention, because it's part of her city, because being on the board of the National Association of Auditors is part of her city business, because she's on it through a connection with the controller's office.
Right.
Just
that's
clarifying.
Right. Yeah.
So I have one last question, I promise. Where did we get the language, the demonstrable nexus language?
And that actually, one of my minor ones.
Yeah.
Can we change that to demonstrated? Demonstrated means it could be and it might not be. Demonstrated means it is.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure if that was taken from certain AOs or certain waivers or whatnot, and to Richard's point. I like that language better.
Okay.
Demonstrated.
It's also on page 7, line 9, and on page 6, line 22. Yeah, demonstrated. Because many things are demonstrable that actually aren't demonstrated. Further on the substantive, and then I have a handful of things like that.
On substantive for the Part B of this, the business dealing with the city. Again, what are examples of this?
I'm so sorry, please.
No, you're a city, you work in an agency, and you are serving because there is a demonstrated nexus, you're serving on the not-for-profit. What are the business dealings you will then be having with the
Well,
city?
for example, there are a number of agencies which rent space from the city, but have no other business dealings with the city. So a public servant designated to work on behalf of a not-for-profit as part of their city job would be able to do all of this not-for-profit's work except anything related to their lease with the city. And that would be sort of an example there, that they wouldn't be able to be involved in the negotiation or issues related to property management of this not-for-profit's lease with the city.
So we wouldn't permit that. It is not permitted here without our approval.
Yes.
But there is an exception there for elected officials. And why are we doing that?
The exception for elected officials is based on this one AO, which is already in the commentary, and the subsequent AO about discretionary funds, where discretionary funds allocated by officials are viewed differently than most other business dealings. And we, for example, a public servant, an elected official who sits on the board of a not-for-profit is prohibited from sponsoring their own discretionary funds for the not-for-profit on which they sit, but they're not prohibited from voting on recommendations for those.
Right, those came out of proceedings at the city council, where we are on that. But for example, putting aside voting for the discretionary funds, you have a not-for-profit. City council member is serving on that not-for-profit. Can that council member negotiate with the city over the contract with that not-for-profit?
No, the exception only applies to the sponsorship of discretionary funding.
Is that what this says?
No, I guess, Jeff, if I could try to answer your question, that paragraph 3 only means that the submission to the board can be made by the elected official, him or herself, and the board still has to decide B. It's still the board's determination about the business dealings. If that's not clear, it's not that the elected official can decide him or herself to be involved in the business dealings. The board still has to make the determination. It's just who's the approving entity.
It's not clear, I find, see, I was confused by that.
Right,
because
right. So
it
that's
says
good to hear.
elected officials may provide these designations and approvals for themselves and members of the staff.
Right. We'll sharpen that up.
So
That's what was intended to be conveyed. That
It
the-
only means that they can come to the board.
Right. The designation of the
But
first
1
part.
and C, not B.
Right, the designation of the first part, the elected official does him or herself as if they were an agency head.
Right.
And then the second part, the approval to come to the board is by the elected official, him or herself, but it's unclear. We'll clean that up.
And in the case of another agency, it's the employee, the individual who comes to the board?
No, the
You
agency
don't
head.
need the agency head.
Right. It's either the agency head or an elected
So
official.
the elected official will, so there's no real difference there, is there?
Just to distinguish, an elected official is not an agency head, and sometimes there's confusion at the council about who the head of the council is, whether the speaker has to authorize for the individual staffs of the council members, so that's what that was.
So what if we were to say an
intended address.
agency head, elected official, just put them all in one category?
I think for agency head, the idea here is, the agency head can't do it for him or herself. The appropriate deputy mayor would have to do it for that agency head. The problem is eventually, as you continue to move up, you run out of people who have supervisors, right? And so that is an elected official doesn't have a person who can, is responsible.
I understand. So if we can make it clear, because I did read it very differently. I read out that the agency head, not the agency head, but an elected official can decide for himself or herself that he or an employee can do business dealings with the city, and that would be a terrible thing, I think.
Yeah, we'll clarify.
Okay.
So that relates, just to clarify what you're clarifying, that relates to sub 3, lines 13 to 17, on page 7. Okay. I have a couple of minor ones, and then everybody else has minor ones. The 19th century grammarian in me would like to rewrite the first line, so it says, an agency head may designate a public servant. Rather, to get good, I hate there as a singular, and I also hate the passive.
Let's go for it.
So why can't we just say an agency head may designate a public servant? The there is really horrible. Especially since you use his or her later in the rule. So if you're trying to avoid his or her, I don't think
Making
it's
it active instead of
I
passive.
think there is making progress.
Yeah, I know, but this one we can get rid of by just making it a more active sentence.
It's a lively debate we have.
There you go. His or her.
This one,
Hard
you
at
use his or her
work
later in the,
here,
it's so
COIB.
funny is you use his or her later in the rule, so it's not even, you're not inconsistent.
We're both wrong and inconsistent.
On line 6 on the next page, it refers to the board. as opposed to the agency?
Yes.
Can we change that to the board's website? Just so there's no uncertainty as to who the "it's" is. On line 9, if after written approval of, who?
Yeah.
Well, who, actually?
In this case, it would be approval of the board, no, of the agency head.
That's what, it would be nice to know.
Yeah.
Right,
Um, And then that's, again, another demonstrated, and then this is somewhere between not minor and substantive. Why is there a pullout for the district attorney on line 15?
The district attorney is not specifically listed on the.
It's because the definition of elected official doesn't include district attorney. So when we use elected official, otherwise it would
Really?
mean the way it's defined in the charter. So we're saying elected official and PS, we also mean district attorney, even though the charter's drafters didn't.
But does that also include on line 3? I mean, even a district attorney might look for discretionary funding for the police foundation to discuss an entity we've discussed
But
previously.
only council members can sponsor discretionary funding. It's a specific.
Sponsorship is a technical word as opposed to a borough president, I can't cite lead funding for this. That's called lobbying and not sponsorship. Sponsorship is a term of art.
Yeah.
Okay. That probably goes to the comment that you're going to write.
Okay.
Explaining more about what sponsorship is and who can do it.
Yeah.
Because sponsorship could either be a technical term or it could be, I want to sponsor some funds and I can get a councilman to do it for me.
Yeah.
Or a borough president might sponsor funding, obviously not in the technical sense.
Yep.
And maybe there should be a reference to this. It just seemed, again, a little bit of an oddity.
Okay, we can
If we
add
could
that to the
regulate,
commentary.
like, if we regulate them, why are we pulling them out? But I would put that in the commentary. Further on the minor and maybe not so minor,
Well, minor point on, back to page 6, line 23. That word "that" in line 23, I think does not belong there.
any further questions, comments, suggestions? Because where I'm going, I think, is although I think we're pretty close, I would like to see this again after both the revision of the end of the rule and the new comments. So although I think our changes are not great, I think they're big enough that we ought to see it again. It's sometimes useful to look at things twice anyway.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So I'm going to call for a motion that the board continue this discussion at a future board meeting.
So moved.
Right? I think I had both a motion and a second, because I got two motions at the same time. So the motion, so now I'm going to call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. The motion for continuation of discussion has passed. There being no further business for consideration pursuant to the Open Meetings Law, this meeting is hereby adjourned. End of open meeting.